Welcome to IPMWORKS e-learning modules. My name is Per Kusk, and I'm a professor at Aarhus University in Denmark. This video is part of Module 2, Plant Health Risk Challenges and Policy Context in the EU, and it will present Chapter 2, Current EU Legislation. When the EU presented the current pesticide legislation back in 2009, they decided to present it as a jigsaw puzzle consisting of 4 pieces. The green piece represents Regulation 1107, which provides the framework for authorization of pesticides in the EU. The red piece is Directive 128, which is a directive which is providing the framework for the sustainable use of pesticides in the EU. The sustainable or the directive is in many ways very unique because no other region in the world, to my knowledge, has a directive or regulations on how to use pesticides. The 2 last pieces deals with the collection on statistics of pesticides and the placing of pesticide application equipment on the market. But in this context, we will not discuss these 2 pieces of legislation. We will focus solely on Regulation 1107 and Directive 128, also called the Sustainable Use Directive. The overall objectives of Regulation 1107 is to protect human and animal health and the environment while improving agricultural productions. And this is done by ensuring that the pesticides which are authorized in the EU are safe to use and doesn't have any adverse effects on human health and environment. Another objective is to harmonize the rules on placing pesticides on the market. EU is a single market, and it's very important to ensure fair competition, and therefore it's also important that the regulations for placing pesticides on the market are the same in all EU countries. Otherwise, it will not be fair competition for farmers in the EU. The Regulation 1107 is a quite comprehensive piece of legislation which consists of several chapters. Now, in this context, I will only discuss Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. And Chapter 2 deals with the regulations for the approval of active substances, safeness, and synergies. That means the approval of the constituents of a pesticide, whereas Chapter 3 deals with the approval of the pesticide products. When it comes to active substances, the assessment is done by one member state, assisted by a second member state on behalf of the whole of the EU. And active substances which are approved in the EU are grouped into 3 different groups. One group is the low-risk active substances, and that are the substances which are considered to pose a very low risk to human health and the environment. And such substances can be approved for 15 years, and the whole process of approval is faster than for other products or other active substances. The second group is just called the approved active substances, and they are the substances which fulfill all the requirements but are not considered to be low-risk active substances. And they can be approved for a period of 10 years. And I should mention that the low-risk substances can be approved for a period of 15 years. And also, I should mention that most of the low-risk active substances on the market in the EU are microorganisms. And then we have the last group, the candidates for substitution, and they also fulfill the requirements for approval, but they are considered to be more hazardous than the approved active substances, and therefore they are only approved for 7 years, and member states should also try to avoid the authorization of products containing candidates for substitution. So if there are any alternatives available, then a member state is supposed to deny the authorization of products which contains candidates for substitution. Now, Chapter 3, as I mentioned, deals with the regulation for the approval of pesticides, and only products which contains approved active substances, safeness, and synergies can be approved in the EU. Now, in contrast to the assessment of active substances, the assessment of pesticide products are done in 3 zones. The EU is divided into a northern zone, a central zone, and a southern zone. And first of all, I should apologize that this figure is actually a bit outdated, because as you can see, the UK is shown as being member of the central zone, but of course the UK is no longer member of the EU, and therefore also not part of the central zone. But within each of these 3 zones, one member state will do the assessment of the pesticides on behalf of the other member states. So there's also a work sharing process going on when it comes to authorization of pesticides in the EU. Now, the regulation 1107 contains a lot of different articles, and many of these articles deals with the specific requirements for approving active substances and pesticides in the EU. I'm not going into any details about these, but I would like to highlight 4 articles which are important for the practical use of pesticides. And the first one I would like to mention is Article 21, which actually lists the products which are exempted from approval, the products which can just be used without any approval in EU member states. And these are products containing basic substances. And what is a basic substance? Well, a basic substance is a substance which has been developed for another purpose, but which have turned out to be also to be effective and can be used as a pesticide. An example of a basic substance is baking powder, which of course is developed for a quite different purpose, but baking powder does also have some impact on certain plant diseases. Now, these basic substances are widely used in organic agriculture, but they're not used very much in conventional agriculture, because typically the efficacy is much lower than of ordinary pesticides. Article 40 describes another important aspect of Regulation 1107, the aspect of mutual recognition. And basically this article says that if a product has been approved in another member state, then this pesticide can also be approved in other member states for the same use, and if the agricultural practices are comparable to the member states where the product was approved first. So basically, let's imagine that there's a product which has been approved in Germany. Then a company can ask for mutual recognition in Denmark without providing any documentation, if it can justify that the use are the same and the agricultural practices are the same. Article 51 is also a very important article in 1107 because it deals with the extension of approvals for minor uses. Now, when we talk about minor uses, we mainly talk about minor crops. And nowadays, very few agrochemical companies are actually asking for approval of pesticides for minor crops, because the benefits, the profits of authorizing a pesticide for a minor crop is simply too small compared to the potential risk if any kind of damage occurs when using this pesticide. So therefore, most agrochemical companies is only authorizing pesticides for the major crops, not for the minor crops. But this Article 51 then actually allows for extension of approvals to minor uses. But then, of course, because there is no data supplied, then the use of these pesticides for minor uses is on the risk of the farmer. A special feature of Article 51 is that this approval for minor uses can be applied for not only by an agrochemical company which owns the product, but it can also be applied for example, scientific bodies involved in agricultural activities. It can be applied for by professional agricultural organization, or it can be applied for by a group of farmers who grow a specific crop and need a pesticide to control a pest. So nearly everyone can apply for a minor use. The last article I would like to highlight here is Article 53, which deals with emergency situations in plant protection. And this is an article which deals with a situation where you have a pest which cannot be contained by any other reasonable means than by using a pesticide which is not authorized in the EU. And in such cases, you can ask for an emergency situation or an emergency authorization, and then you can be allowed to use a pesticide which is otherwise not allowed to use in the EU to control that specific pest. And the duration of such an approval is only 120 days. So typically you will have to apply again and again and again if this pest occurs frequently. Now, one of the most recent cases of emergency situation was when the neonics insecticides were banned in the EU, and then actually there was in several countries there was granted emergency situations to the use of neonics in sugar beets and in oilseed rape, because it was felt in these countries that there was no other alternative to control some very damaging pest which occurs in these crops. Moving on to Directive 128, which deals with the sustainable use of pesticides. The objective is to reduce the risk and impacts of pesticide use on human health and the environment, and to promote the use of integrated pest management and of alternative approaches or techniques such as non-chemical alternatives to pesticides. And to achieve that objective of reducing risk and impacts, each member states are asked to consider a number of areas where measures can be taken to reduce the risk and impacts. And these areas are described in the Articles 5 to 15. Now, I will not go into detail. As you can see, it's a very wide range of areas where member state has to take action. But I will not go into detail with that in this presentation here. Instead, I will refer to Chapter 3, which presents how this has been done in Denmark and what kind of measures has been taken in Denmark to meet the requirements in each of these articles. Another requirement in the directive is that each country should produce a national action plan. And what is a national action plan? Well, it's a plan which provides an overview of, for example, all the measures which are taken to implement the provisions which are defined by Article 5 to 15, as I showed on the previous slide. National action plan could also contain quantitative targets for reducing pesticide impacts and measures, and timetables on how to reach the goals. Not all EU member states have set quantitative targets, but some have set quantitative targets. And if that's the case, then the member states are supposed also to present a timetable on how to reach the goals. Then the national action plans should describe how the member states intend to promote the development and uptake of IPM and alternative crop protection measures. And then finally, also the national action plans should be monitoring the use of active substances of specific concern. These national action plans should be revised every 5 years, and they are publicly available. And the link which is provided in this slide by using that link, you have access to all the national action plans or the action plan from all EU member states. In the directive, there is also a definition of IPM. Now, I will not read this definition. As you can see, it's a relatively long and very detailed definitions, but maybe it's important just to focus on the last part of the definition, where it says that it emphasizes that integrated pest management is the growth of a healthy crop with the least possible disruption to agroecosystem and encourage natural pest control mechanisms. This definition is very, very similar to the definition which was published by FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, some years ago. Now, in the directive, the EU also provides 8 IPM principles. And I've listed the IPM principles, and I'll just go through these IPM principles very, very quickly. The first IPM principle deals with prevention or suppression of harmful organisms. And this, of course, is a cornerstone of IPM, and as many people consider this to be really the most important IPM principle, that any measures should be taken to minimize the risk of having pest problems in your crop. And that could be by considering crop rotation, considering soil conservation, but also considering how you can promote beneficials in the agroecosystems. Second IPM principle deals with monitoring of pests and encourage farmers to use field observation, to use warning, forecasting, and early diagnosis systems, as well as to seek advice from professional qualified advisors. So monitoring pests is a very important part of IPM, because this is the only way that a sound decision can be taken on whether to control or not to control. And part of this monitoring is also to use threshold values and other decision support systems to reach the correct decision whether to control or not control. And then if the decision is that control is required, then IPM principle 4 says that non-chemical methods should be considered before any pesticides if the non-chemical methods are sufficiently effective. And 5, 6, and 7 then deals with a situation where non-chemical methods are not available and therefore pesticides are used, because if pesticides are used, they should be as specific as possible for the target, and they should have the least side effects on health, environment, and non-target organisms. Also, the use of pesticides should be kept to a minimum level, or to the level which are necessary. This can be done by reducing the doses or by reducing the number of applications, or partial application, that means only treating part of the field. And then the IPM principle 7 is a bit specific, because it basically deals with the cases where there is a risk of resistance to the pesticides. And if that's the case, then the anti-resistance strategies should be also be applied. And then the IPM principle number 8 is really the final one, where a farmer is supposed to, based on all the records which have been made throughout the season, is asked to basically sit down and evaluate whether the adopted strategy has been sufficiently effective or should be maybe adjusted for the next growing season. Now, it's important to stress that these are IPM principles, and in practice, it may be very difficult to apply principles, and therefore a very, very important part of promoting IPM is really to convert these IPM principles into IPM tools or IPM strategies that the farmers can actually apply. And this is where researchers and advisors becomes pivotal in ensuring that IPM is actually taken up by farmers in the EU. Thank you very much for your attention.